Welcome to another episode of Raph's Retro Comics. And in this episode, I'm going to talk about comic books that make you gasp. Let's look at the horror genre in comic book history. Okay, horror comic books. The first horror comic book came out in 1947, and the title was called Eerie. It was published by Avon. But horror comic books really didn't start to kick it into high gear until 1950, when a publisher called EC Comics started to publish a more mature line or new line of comic books. And this was kind of to respond to, I guess, a shift of an aging population that grew up on comic books that demanded kind of a more mature line of subjects that were more interesting for them. So, we got horror, we got crime, Western, and romance. And these were typically geared towards kind of an older reader. But again, like younger people were reading them as well. So EC was taken over by William Gaines, who inherited this company from his dad, who passed away suddenly. And along with Al Feldstein, the two of them were responsible for doing a lot of the writing and editorial work for their line of comic books initially. And they had three flagship horror titles. The first I'm going to mention is Tales from the Crypt. Now, the first three issues of this were actually called Crypt of Terror, and then they switched to Tales from the Crypt. The second one I'm going to mention is Vault of Horror. And the third one, Haunt of Fear. They also had what I would call two other sister titles that were not specifically horror, but a lot of collectors now kind of lump them into the same group. And one is Crime Suspense Stories, which is really a crime comic book, but some of the covers in this series are really, really, how would I say? Well, they're kind of horrific, like this one over here. And the other title is Shock Suspense Stories. Shock Suspense Stories is actually probably my favorite of the five that I mentioned. And the reason why is because it had a variety of stories where Tales from the Crypt, Haunt of Fear, and Vault of Horror were all kind of horror stories. Shock Suspense Stories had a mix of science fiction, crime, war, and horror. And so, every issue had a nice, interesting mix of different stories. So, unfortunately, I no longer have any more original issues. What you're looking at here are reprints. And it's a testament to how good these, or popular these stories were, in that they've since been reprinted many times and in many different formats. And so, it's a good thing because these original issues are now very expensive in any kind of condition. And although I do miss owning some of the originals, it's really nice to still be able to have reprints that, that still give you that same feel of flipping over one of these old comic books. Okay, so as you can tell from these covers, they're really quite brutal. And EC had a big part in what was the creation of the Comics Code Authority, which was a regulatory body that ended up policing the content of these comic books. And this came about from, basically from parents, from adults who felt that comic books at that time were a really bad influence to kids. And there was one kind of famous book written by Frederick Wertham, I believe, called Seduction of the Innocent, that really drove the creation of the Comics Code Authority. And actually there were like Senate hearings where William Gaines had to kind of testify, and it was really kind of like a dark period for comic books, and the reputation of comic books at that time took a big hit. And, you know, it's understandable, because if you were to take a look at the content of some of these comic books, you would certainly feel that, these comic books are really not for kids. But at the same time, you can't forget that comic books were not just being read by kids, but, you know, older people and as well as adults. Especially, you know, when you look at some of like the crime comic books and some of these horror comic books. Okay, so that being said, why don't we take a look in the box and take a look at one of these issues. Let's just dive right in. This is a Vault of Horror reprint. This was published by Gladstone, and this came out in about 1991. Now, these were double-sized issues, and not only did it reprint the Vault of Horror, but inside there's an issue of weird fantasy as well too. Generally, the horror issues sold better than the science fiction issues, but you can generally find these, if you're lucky, for under $10. Now, they started to get more expensive, especially the ones with the notorious covers. But, you know, you should still be able to find these, you know, without too much difficulty. The interesting thing about this one is that it reprints Vault of Horror number 32, but in the original issue here, as you'll notice, the colors are different, but there's also another significant difference. And it's this poor fellow. Well, he's got an axe in the head in this one, but not in the original one. So they originally, you know, kind of published these in like a double-sized format, but then they started to publish them again, and this came out in 97 in single-issue format. And as well, you can kind of see the slight difference. And I really do like these. Like, these are best enjoyed like an issue here and there. Although Tales from the Crypt and Vault of Horror are probably the more popular titles, I think like Haunt of Fear is generally not as appreciated as much or as sought after as much. So let's take a look at an issue of Haunt of Fear. All right, this is a great issue, and this is originally Haunt of Fear number 19. It has a bondage beheading covered. Look at the double axe on that. That's kind of crazy. But one of the stories in this issue had a lot of notoriety, and I'm gonna take you there. Not the double header. But this one, Foul Play. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the story. This was actually used in the book by Wortham in Seduction of the Innocent. And it's a story about baseball. You have two teams, and you have one player on the opposing team that decides to play dirty. And to ensure that his team wins the pennant, what he does is this is a bit far-fetched, a bit of a stretch, but what he does is he poisons his spikes, and then he deliberately spikes the second baseman or the shortstop. And as you can tell, like, the thing about EC stories is that there's a lot of writing, but as well, it's, you know, it can kind of give you well, there's a lot there, but so what he does is he spikes the second baseman, and at the important part of the game, when that all-star second baseman goes up to bat, he just ends up dying, and he's struck out. And the team doctor finds out that, oh, he didn't die of a heart attack or anything like that. He was actually poisoned. And they figure, whoa, how did he get poisoned? And then they realize it's the player from the other team that deliberately spiked him and poisoned him. So, poison spikes. So what they do is they set up a meeting to meet that player in the evening to talk about a special award. And this is the notorious page where they show what they did to this player. And this page is something that you often see use as one of the lowlights, or I suppose, or the highlights of that era horror, where they use that player's body parts as the field and his head as the ball. So, wow, pretty crazy. Like this is there were even some complaints, I think, from the readers about how they kind of went over the top. But yeah, if you get a chance to read this, it's really, this last page, the setup to the last page is really quite something. Now, what's also great about this issue of Haunt of Fear, well, this double issue, is it has another really landmark story. Wow, there's really some beautiful artwork in here as well, too, for that time. I believe this one is Williamson. But the story is Judgment Day. And way ahead of its time. You have an Earthman going to a robot colony, and I don't want to spoil this anymore, but all I can say is that this is considered also a very important story. Not like the last one, like Foul Play, in that this one has a powerful message about anti-racism, essentially. Way ahead of its time. And so it's certainly worth reading. So yeah, that is one of the notorious issues of Haunt of Fear. Maybe the most notorious story. All right, let's take a look at another. So I mentioned shock suspense stories, and this is actually one of my favorite issues. One of the reasons why is because I believe this is the first issue where Reed Crandall from Blackhawk fame, because I always have to mention Blackhawk. This is his first artwork, and he does a story called Carry. He does the artwork for the story called Carry on Death, and it's the feature story from the cover. And you have to wonder, how does one get into a position like this? And it's explained pretty well in this story. Actually, I don't really want to spoil this story, but suffice to say, it's certainly one of the better ones. And I find this series to be kind of a little underrated compared to the horror stuff. What I do like, though, is not only these single issues, but if you're able to, you can look for these guys. And these are big hardcover archives that reprint the stories in a larger format. And they retain as well some of the interiors, but they also have wonderful little bios of the different writers and artists who contributed to these stories. The October Game, which is also in that issue of Shock Suspense Stories that I showed you, is an adaptation, a Ray Bradbury adaptation, a well-known science fiction writer. And
Yeah, so as I mentioned, even at the end of that story, we have an article featuring the, Reed Crandall, boarding the EC ship. So, shock suspense stories. A great kind of title of different genres to really check out. Crime, horror, war, science fiction, all rolled into one. And the last thing I wanted to show was just maybe there's a bit of a glare there, a closer up of that issue of Gasp. This was published in 1967 by ACG, American Comics Group, and it didn't last very long. 4 issues. I like picking up weird, how would you say, oddball titles that you just don't see very often. ECs are very popular, collected by a lot of people. If you look at the Silver Age, Marvel and DC, especially Marvel, dominate the collector's market. But it's as you become kind of like an older collector, sometimes you start to look for kind of the obscure, kind of weird stuff that you just don't see that often. And when you come across something like this, it's like, wow, I've never seen that before. And sometimes, like in an issue like this, it's not collected just because, it's just not very good. I mean, look at the stories featured in this issue. Those terrible teenagers. Whoa. Beneath the old cellar. The devil's a businessman. It doesn't grab you as much, but I still think they're really quite interesting. And when you do pick them up, especially when they're kind of like in this kind of like a nice condition, they're it's like, wow, neat, cool. This is kind of like my crap comic book of the week. So there you go.
Shocking, I say. Well, there you go. I hope you learned a little bit about horror in old comic books. And I hope you can check some out. They're certainly not that hard to find, and they're quite enjoyable. I'll probably do another 1 or 2 on this subject, as it's quite interesting. So, thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time on Raph's Retro Comics.